Mr. President, members of the court, you have heard the excruciating details of Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations and the many indicators of genocidal intent associated with their planning, organization, and brutal execution, and the failure to punish any of the perpetrators who continue to enjoy absolute impunity. Myanmar's defense is that it was carrying out legitimate counterterrorism or counterinsurgency operations. As the evidence shows, that is demonstrably false. Myanmar's clearance operations were the antithesis of legitimate counterterrorism operations. First, I will discuss the many reasons why the clearance operations, which Myanmar claims to have been directed against ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, were not legitimate counterterrorism operations. Then I will demonstrate the same by comparing the anti-Rohingya clearance operations with Myanmar's operations against the Arakan Army, the rebel faction composed of ethnic Rakhine Buddhists, and with Myanmar's operations against ethnic separatist groups in other regions of the country. Next, I will show that Myanmar's evidence is unreliable and not entitled to evidential weight. And finally, I will address Myanmar's arguments regarding the context of the clearance operations. The defining features of Myanmar's anti-Rohingya clearance operations cannot reasonably be explained by an intent to counter terrorism because those operations violated the fundamental tenets of legitimate counterterrorism operations. The court has the benefit of two expert reports from Professor Michael Newton, a respected legal scholar, former military officer, and specialist in international law related to armed conflict and counterterrorism operations. The court also has an affidavit from Professor Newton, and we'll hear from him directly next Thursday. As Professor Newton explained in his reports and affidavit, the fundamental tenets of legitimate counterterrorism operations include: 1, a clear distinction between the terrorist or insurgent group and civilians; 2, a focus on providing security to or protection for the civilian population; and 3, strictly following rules of engagement to limit collateral damage to civilians. Myanmar grossly and deliberately ignored and violated all three of these elements in its anti-Rohingya clearance operations. First, it is evident that Myanmar did not distinguish between ARSA's members and Rohingya civilians. The presentations you have heard from my colleagues regarding the conduct of the clearance operations in Mingi, Chutpin, Mongnu, other notable villages, and generally across northern Rakhine State clearly show that the civilian population, innocent and unarmed men, boys, women, girls, the elderly, the infirm, that civilian population was specifically targeted. This is the conclusion of the UN fact-finding mission, which reported that the anti-Rohingya clearance operations, quote, have been marked by an equation between an entire civilian population, the Rohingya, and the non-state armed actor that was the perceived or stated threat. No distinction whatsoever was made between civilians and civilian objects on the one hand, and fighters and military objectives on the other. Everyone and everything was a target. The operations and use of force were not targeted at eliminating a specific and limited security threat posed by ARSA. They were targeted at eliminating ARSA's support base, if not the group, the Rohingya itself. The UN FFM's conclusions are corroborated by other independent sources. For example, the report of the US Department of State also found that, quote, the military which used the ARSA attacks to justify its so-called counterinsurgency operations in northern Rakhine State, targeted civilians indiscriminately and often with extreme brutality, end quote. Amnesty International, which Myanmar has cited in its pleadings regarding ARSA's actions, concluded in the same report that Myanmar's, quote, unlawful and grossly disproportionate campaign of violence marked by killings, rape, and other sexual violence, torture, village burning, forced starvation tactics, and other human rights violations and crimes under international law target the entire Rohingya population living in northern Rakhine State. End quote. A joint report by Fortify Rights and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum found that the 2016 clearance operations were, quote, targeted attacks on a large number of Rohingya civilians, end quote, and that the 2017 operations targeted, quote, hundreds of Rohingya villages and hundreds of thousands of civilians, end quote. Even the International Crisis Group, which Myanmar cites repeatedly, confirms that the Tatmadaw used, quote, disproportionate force, which failed to adequately distinguish militants from civilians, end quote. But you don't have to rely solely on the considered findings of these independent and credible sources. Myanmar itself admits that it targeted all Rohingya in the villages where it conducted operations. It is Myanmar's position that, quote, large-scale mobilization of the local community was essential to ARSA's activities, end quote. Throughout its pleadings, as you can see on your screens, Myanmar states very clearly that the clearance operations targeted ARSA, quote, and its supporters, and its supporters. By its supporters, Myanmar means the local community, i.e. all villagers, no matter their age or gender or their engagement in anti-government actions. You may think my interpretation of Myanmar's position sounds excessive, but Myanmar actually says this in its counter memorial at paragraph 13.214, which you can see on your screens. It states, quote, the terrorists and supporters comprised men, women, and children. Women and children. And were drawn in their thousands from the local communities. Generally speaking, neither uniforms nor insignia were worn by ARSA terrorists and its supporters, who would not be readily distinguishable from civilians not involved in the ARSA activities. End quote. And children. Children. No wonder so many children were targeted for brutal murder. Myanmar considered them terrorists or their supporters. No wonder so many civilians were brutally slaughtered. Myanmar claims that it could not distinguish civilians from ARSA or those it considered its supporters. So with this outrageous claim, according to which each and every Rohingya is a born terrorist and ARSA lifelong supporter, Myanmar wants you to accept that it was legitimate for its soldiers to indiscriminately attack and kill everyone. After reviewing Myanmar's pleadings on this point, Professor Newton also concluded that Myanmar's own pleadings constitute, quote, an admission that security forces deliberately conflated Rohingya civilians with ARSA and then attacked and destroyed them, end quote. To justify its targeting of civilians, Myanmar will surely assert that ARSA mobilized all the villagers. But that is also false. The UN fact-finding mission confirmed that ARSA remained small and represented no more than a tiny fraction of the Rohingya population. In fact, the sources that Myanmar relies upon so heavily, the International Crisis Group and Amnesty International, Both explicitly reject the claim that Rohingya civilians took up the ARSA cause in significant numbers. The Amnesty International report cited repeatedly by Myanmar makes clear, quote, while Amnesty International has confirmed that some Rohingya villagers participated in ARSA attacks, the overwhelming majority of Rohingya did not. Even in the specific villages where attacks occurred, there is no question that most villagers did not take part in ARSA attacks, end quote. Similarly, the International Crisis Group concluded that, quote, not many villagers appear to have joined the attack on the army base in Chinta Mar village, end quote. One of the more significant ARSA attacks that Myanmar alleges to have taken place, but, quote, which was quickly overpowered. The report also found that the ARSA commander's call to his followers to burn down Rakhine Buddhist villages, quote, does not appear to have been widely acted upon, as only 3 non-Rohingya villages are known to have been attacked or burned down by Rohingya, end quote. So the alleged massive support for ARSA was actually insignificant. Despite that fact, Myanmar deliberately chose not to distinguish between ARSA and civilians when it carried out the clearance operations. Myanmar also violated the second fundamental counterinsurgency principle of providing security or protection to the civilian population in order not to alienate it. Myanmar has alleged that ARSA was a threat to the civilian Rohingya population. It stated in its counter memorial that, quote, ARSA was responsible for killing many Muslims in the region who worked for the government or were suspected of being informants or collaborators, end quote. It went on to state that ARSA engaged in, quote, attacks on civilians, murders of local leaders, violent threats against both the Muslim and Rakhine communities, end quote. So if Myanmar had been engaged in legitimate counterterrorism operations, then it should not only have distinguished between ARSA and Rohingya civilians, it also should have provided security and protection to the Rohingya civilian population, which it claims was threatened by ARSA. The evidence indicates that it did no such thing. As I presented on Monday afternoon, we know that before and during the clearance operations, Myanmar engaged in a hate propaganda campaign that dehumanized the Rohingya, vilified them collectively as an impure race, as foreigners and terrorists who would swallow up the Buddhist races in Myanmar, and it incited hatred and genocide against them. As explained by Mr. Lowenstein, we also know that before the clearance operations, Myanmar systematically made the Rohingya less secure, not more. They took down protective fencing and confiscated any materials that could have served as defensive weapons, like kitchen knives. Rather than help the local Rohingya communities defend against the so-called threat from ARSA, they focused on making them completely defenseless against the military's wanton violence to come. And we also know from the detailed village-level presentations of my colleagues about the conduct of the clearance operations that the Tatmadaw did not focus on providing security at all. Just the opposite, time and time again, as you have heard. As summarized by the UN fact-finding mission, quote, the operations had a devastating impact on the Rohingya civilian population, which was targeted, brutalized, and terrorized. Rohingya-populated areas across the 3 townships of northern Rakhine State were deliberately destroyed in a targeted manner. Professor Newton also concluded that Myanmar attacked Rohingya civilians rather than taking actions to protect and secure them from ARSA. Beyond destroying Rohingya villages during and after the clearance operations, the evidence shows that even after these operations were conducted, rather than protecting Rohingya civilians and their property, Myanmar sought to erase and replace them permanently. You heard from Mr. Lowenstein yesterday about the findings of the IIMM's September 2025 public summary of its report entitled "The Destruction and Dispossession of Rohingya Land and Property During the 2017 Clearance Operations." That detailed report identified 7 representative examples of a systematic pattern in which, quote, the 2017 clearance operations combined land seizure, targeted destruction of livelihoods, and forced displacement to erase Rohingya presence from their ancestral homeland, end quote. The IIMM concluded that, quote, the ubiquity and consistency of these operations, using bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks to systematically flatten villages across northern Rakhine State, is consistent with an organized campaign aimed at permanently erasing Rohingya presence, end quote. The IIMM found that Myanmar was systematically dispossessing Rohingya of their land and property and foreclosing the possibility of their return. Myanmar was also replacing the Rohingya with more favored ethnic groups. The IIMM reported that, quote, hundreds of new houses funded by regional governments and foundations were handed over to ethnic Mro and Dainet families and recent immigrants from Bangladesh, which, quote, indicate that the Myanmar authorities carried out demographic replacement under the guise of development and resettlement, end quote. There is a separate IIMM report on this topic at Annex 7 of the Gambia's reply, which confirms that Myanmar had a, quote, wider strategy to alter the ethnic makeup of Rakhine State to remove or reduce the influence of Muslims, end quote. The IIMM concluded that, collectively, these acts, quote, created very serious impediments to the ability of Rohingya to ever reconstitute the communities where they had lived for generations, end quote. And that was the point. Myanmar did not even pretend to try to protect Rohingya civilians from ARSA. The goal was always their destruction as a group within Myanmar. Myanmar also violated the third fundamental tenet of counterterrorism by failing to adhere to rules of engagement and to limit collateral damage to civilians. Myanmar's rules of engagement, which were annexed to its counter memorial at Annex 152, reflect standard counterinsurgency doctrine as set forth by Professor Newton. They require, for example, the military to distinguish between civilians and combatants, minimize collateral damage to civilians and property through the use of proportionate force, give advance warning before attack, attack only when necessary to attain the military objectives, do not take or destroy property owned by civilians, and provide special protection for children and women, end quote. But Myanmar did not follow its own rules of engagement. It failed to distinguish between civilians and ARSA. It failed to protect the civilian population. It admitted to including women and children among its military targets. And it deliberately destroyed the villages of the Rohingya civilian population. Furthermore, on its face, the rules of engagement indicate that the mission objective was to quote, counter attacks by AA, that's Arakan Army, and ARSA terrorists, end quote. Period. Not to attack alleged ARSA supporters, not to attack and kill Rohingya civilians, not to destroy their villages and every trace of them. There is compelling evidence from diverse sources establishing that orders were given to Tatmadaw soldiers to kill all Rohingya. These sources include, among others, the following 7. 1, the August 2017 video of the Tatmadaw soldier telling Rakhine civilians, quote, "We will be moving around the area, clearing the villages of these animals. We have guns, we have bullets. That's what we came with ammunition and the spirit to attack these animals. We have come here," end quote. Recall from my Monday afternoon presentation that this video was disseminated by the Tatmadaw repeatedly on Facebook to reach the widest possible audience across Myanmar. Second, the IIMM screening note of P5513, a military defector, who stated that, quote, in 2017, the military did not distinguish between fighters of Rohingya armed groups and Rohingya civilians. So they targeted Rohingya as a group, end quote. The accuracy and reliability of P5513's account was attested to in a sworn declaration by IIMM investigator Viral. 3, 2 Tatmadaw soldiers who participated in the clearance operations and later defected testified in their video statements annexed to the memorial that they were ordered to kill everyone, men, women, and children, all members of the Rohingya group, without distinction, to, quote, shoot at every sight of a person, end quote. 4, a Tatmadaw soldier from the 33rd Light Infantry Division told the Rohingya during the clearance operations in mid-August 2017 in a village in Rathadong that, quote, the central government sent us specially to kill you Bengali people, end quote. Number 5, Nazmul Islam, a former soldier and ethnically Rakhine man who converted to Islam and was held by the Tatmadaw during its clearance operations in Mingi, stated that a military officer announced, quote, we have the order to kill everyone, end quote. His account, which was published in The Guardian, is confirmed by his video interview annexed to the reply. 6, a witness from Maungnu testified in a sworn statement that he observed a Tatmadaw officer receive instructions by phone, and after hanging up, he told his fellow soldiers, quote, we will kill them. After that, the executions of Rohingya civilians in Maungnu began. 7, Mo Yan Nang, a police captain who was stationed in Rakhine, stated in relation to the village of Indin that, quote, the troops shot into the village before entering. They shot and killed whoever they found in the village, end quote. There can be no doubt that Myanmar purposefully targeted all of the Rohingya population and did not seek to minimize collateral damage. As Professor Newton observes, quote, Myanmar's rules of engagement demonstrate that Myanmar understood and accepted standard counterinsurgency doctrine during the entire period that it was ignoring them in practice, end quote. Mr. President, members of the court, further proof that Myanmar's counterterrorism defense is unfounded comes from comparing Myanmar's counterinsurgency operations against the Arakan army with its actions allegedly targeting ARSA. First, I should note some differences between the two groups. While ARSA is made up of members of the Rohingya group, the Arakan army is comprised of ethnic Rakhine, mainly Buddhists. The Arakan army was founded in 2009 and was active in Rakhine State years before ARSA even existed. Myanmar acknowledges in its counter memorial that, quote, since March 2015, there has in Rakhine State also been an armed conflict between the Myanmar Defense Services and the Arakan Army, end quote. And since, quote, November 2018, attacks by the Arakan Army intensified in Rakhine State, end quote. The difference in military capabilities between both groups is stark. According to Myanmar, the Arakan Army, quote, has a significant military armory, end quote. It, quote, receives arms and ammunition from the Kachin Independence Army and the United Wa State Army, and also purchases weaponry and ammunition on the black market at the Thai-Myanmar border, end quote. The UN fact-finding mission reported that the Arakan Army is a, quote, well-trained force that operates under a clear command structure, end quote, and its weaponry includes, quote, sniper rifles, light artillery, and improvised explosive devices, end quote. As confirmed by Myanmar in its most recent Provisional Measures Implementation Report, the Arakan Army has effectively taken over almost all of Rakhine State, including all of northern Rakhine State. In contrast, according to the UN fact-finding mission, ARSA members mostly had nothing but, quote, homemade weapons such as sticks, knives, swords, and slingshots. The mission found that ARSA was a small, poorly organized militia that didn't have the skill or resources to launch an attack that could truly challenge Myanmar's security forces. Most of those considered to have joined the ARSA attacks received no training at all prior to the 2017 attacks. These findings are confirmed by the IIMM's report on, quote, evidence of ARSA's weapons possession and use, which is annexed to the Gambia's reply. The IIMM found that ARSA's weapons were limited and primitive. At the time of the August 2017 attacks, ARSA had only a, quote, modest arsenal of around 40 to 70 firearms, end quote. The majority of ARSA's members used, quote, bladed weapons, sticks, and a small number of locally produced artisanal firearms, end quote. In light of these profound differences between the Arakan Army and ARSA in capacity and level of threat, a comparison of Myanmar's operations against the Arakan Army with its conduct of the clearance operations in northern Rakhine State is especially revealing. Both of these entities operate primarily in Rakhine State. Myanmar considers both of them as terrorist groups. Myanmar conducted so-called clearance operations against both. And most importantly, Myanmar applied the exact same rules of engagement to both. So if we were to assume that Myanmar actually followed its rules of engagement, then the nature of military operations employed against both groups should be very similar, perhaps with some differences to account for the greater military capabilities, weaponry, and organization of the Arakan Army. But this is not reflected in the evidence. To the contrary, we see very clearly the genocidal intent that permeated Myanmar's anti-Rohingya operations. It was only against the Rohingya that the Myanmar military targeted the entire civilian population in village after village where it conducted operations. Only against the Rohingya was there such brutal violence that included the indiscriminate killing of thousands of people, including children. Only against the Rohingya did the military systematically engage in brutal sexual violence. Only against the Rohingya did the military burn down hundreds of villages, taking care not to burn down the ethnic Rakhine villages adjacent to the Rohingya ones. It was only Rohingya land that was confiscated and built over by the state in an effort to permanently dispossess the Rohingya of their land. And it was only the Rohingya who were subjected to discriminatory policies for decades and a campaign of hate propaganda to dehumanize and incite violence against them. All of these factual differences are borne out in the reporting of the UN fact-finding mission, which specifically investigated Myanmar's conflict with the Arakan Army in its 2019 detailed report. While the FFM found that Myanmar committed war crimes in its operations against the Arakan Army, it did not find genocidal intent or similar types of genocidal violence against the Rakhine Buddhist population as it found, were perpetrated against the Rohingya. Specifically, the FFM did not find any indiscriminate killing of Rakhine Buddhists, nor did it find that there was brutal treatment, burning of homes, widespread sexual violence, or targeting of children in the Rakhine Buddhist villages. Neither did it find comparable, deliberate destruction of those villages, the forced displacement of the civilian population, or the prevention of their return. In this comparison, the court can find confirmation that Myanmar acted with genocidal intent during its anti-Rohingya clearance operations. These were manifestly not legitimate counterterrorism operations. Additional comparisons outside of Rakhine State can be instructive as well. Myanmar recognizes that since the time of its independence, it has, quote, been engaged more or less continuously in internal insurgencies with various ethnically based insurgent groups in different parts of the country, end quote. According to the UN fact-finding mission, these include the Kachin Independence Army, the Shan State Army South, the Shan State Army North, the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the United Wa State Army. In its reporting, the FFM pointed out violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by the Tatmadaw in Shan and Kachin states involving these groups. The United Nations has also had a special rapporteur monitoring the human rights situation in Myanmar since 1992. The reports of the special rapporteur have also focused on violations involving Myanmar's conflicts with various ethnic armed organizations. Even though Myanmar has engaged in counterinsurgency operations against all of these groups over many years, its actions against them have never included the same indicators of genocidal intent as are present in their actions against the Rohingya, from its anti-Rohingya hate propaganda and racially discriminatory policies, through its conduct in the clearance operations and beyond. My next point relates to the evidence that Myanmar offers in support of its counterterrorism defense. Myanmar presents reports produced by the military related to the clearance operations, witness statements from 7 military or police officers, several witness statements from local residents of Rakhine State, and witness statements from 2 alleged members of ARSA who are prisoners in Buthodong prison. None of these sources are credible or reliable. First, the military's own reports show only what the military decided should be reported regarding those incidents. They are not reports from an independent source, nor are they comprehensive as to the events that took place in those villages. Moreover, these reports are contradicted by the evidence from independent and unbiased sources that the Gambia has placed in the record, including the findings of the UN fact-finding mission, dozens of independent NGO reports, and sworn witness statements from eyewitnesses. There is also reliable evidence produced by the IIMM that indicates that Myanmar military reports regarding the clearance operations, apart from being self-serving, were falsified. The IIMM screening note from military defector P5513 states that regarding the incidents in the village of Sin O Pien in Buthodong Township, the deputy battalion commander dictated the information for the incident report. According to P5513, quote, the report stated that ARSA attacked the military and in response they cleared the village, and that when ARSA withdrew from Sin O Pien, they, ARSA, burned down the village. Asked if the contents of the report as dictated were consistent with what P5513 had observed, P5513 stated that the report as written was not factual or correct. It was, in fact, Light Infantry Battalion 562 who burned down the village. There were no firearms or ammunition. He did not believe that the deceased people were ARSA, but rather they were civilians, as evidenced by the fact that he even saw children amongst the dead." End quote. As to Myanmar's witness statements, they are all purportedly from 2017 or 2019, but Myanmar never explains the circumstances of their production. They appear to have been part of some Myanmar military inquiry, meaning that they were not part of an independent process. As Professor Dargent clearly showed, Myanmar's purported investigations and inquiries were not credible and were part of a system reinforcing impunity for Myanmar's crimes. Any statements created through such biased processes are not reliable or credible. It is notable that although Myanmar listed 3 military officers as witnesses for oral testimony during these hearings, Myanmar ultimately removed all of their names from its witness list. The statements of 2 of those officers are among the statements that Myanmar annexed to its rejoinder. But since Myanmar has not produced them for oral testimony, we cannot question them through cross-examination, nor can they answer questions from the court. Myanmar also submitted witness statements from 2 alleged ARSA members who are incarcerated in Buthodong prison. As Ms. Ho noted yesterday, they are thus completely under Myanmar's control in a prison facility that is notorious for torture and other forms of abuse, as documented in the IIMM's report on evidence related to detention of Rohingya in Buthodong prison and other locations, which was annexed to the reply. As Ms. Ho pointed out, Myanmar's influence on their testimony is readily apparent on the face of their statements. Members of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, it would be odd to say the least that they would refer to themselves as Bengali, the term that Myanmar seeks to force the Rohingya to adopt. Most of the witness statements have been submitted by Myanmar to argue that the Rohingya burned their own villages down. That claim is contradicted by extensive evidence and analysis by the UN fact-finding mission, UNISAT, and the IIMM, all of which conclude that Myanmar purposefully burned the Rohingya villages. The falsity of that claim is also clear, given that Myanmar's efforts to fabricate evidence of such burnings by instrumentalizing the local Hindu community was exposed by journalists. I turn now to my final point, which is that context is not a defense to genocide. Myanmar insists that the context of the clearance operations was ARSA's attacks in 2016 and 2017, and that the Gambia ignores this. Of course, the Gambia never ignored this. You can see, going all the way back to the Gambia's application at paragraph 48, a description of the 9 October 2016 incident by a group of individuals who later called themselves Harakat al-Yaqin, which changed its name several months later to ARSA. And at paragraph 72 of the application, the Gambia stated very clearly that Myanmar's pretext for resuming clearance operations on 25 August 2017 was attacks on a military base and various security outposts by ARSA, carried out largely by untrained individuals wielding sticks and knives, with a small number bearing arms and improvised explosive devices. That same position has carried throughout the Gambia's pleadings. More importantly, as Myanmar acknowledges, the UN fact-finding mission never ignored ARSA. It extensively reported on ARSA and its activities, including its human rights abuses, which Myanmar cites extensively. The IIMM produced an entire report dedicated to ARSA, analyzing its capabilities and the nature of the potential threat it posed. Most of the NGOs whose reports the Gambia cites also reported on ARSA and its abuses. So all of these entities were fully aware of ARSA when they produced their reports and made their conclusions. The fact that ARSA's attacks preceded the genocidal clearance operations does not make it any less valid that Myanmar and its soldiers had the requisite genocidal intent as they planned and carried out their attacks. It is well established that the context of genocidal acts is not a defense to genocide. It is just that, the context. War has been context for genocide. The Holocaust occurred during World War II. The Srebrenica genocide occurred during the Yugoslav wars. The Rwanda genocide occurred during a civil war. Just because the context of these past genocides was war or internal armed conflict did not mean that genocide did not take place. The same is true here. Even if the immediate pretext for the clearance operations was ARSA attacks, that does not negate or excuse the genocidal acts deliberately perpetrated by Myanmar against the Rohingya group in carrying them out. Moreover, the context relevant to this case extends far beyond the ARSA attacks. It includes Myanmar's decades-long persecution of the Rohingya and Myanmar's many years-long campaign of hate propaganda, and all of Myanmar's actions after the clearance operations, including its impunity, destruction of evidence, and the destruction of Rohingya villages. Finally, it is not true that Myanmar's clearance operations were limited to villages where ARSA attacks allegedly took place. You will recall from yesterday that Mr. Lowenstein showed you Myanmar's figure 8.1 from its counter memorial, onto which he overlaid the map of village destruction during the clearance operations produced by UNOSAT, which is figure 1.3 of the memorial. The resulting map, which is reply figure 1.2, shows that most of those green dots where Myanmar asserts no ARSA attacks took place are villages that, according to the United Nations, were destroyed during and after the clearance operations. Myanmar wholly or partially destroyed at least 188 out of the 329 villages where, according to Myanmar, there was absolutely no ARSA presence and no pretense for any counterterrorism operations. Put simply, Myanmar's argument that the clearance operations were only responsive to ARSA attacks is refuted by its own evidence. Myanmar argues that its counterterrorism operations ended on 5 September 2017, but the UNOSAT figures depict villages that underwent fire damage from 31 August 2017 to March 2018. Myanmar admits that some of the village burning happened after the purported end of their clearance operations. This is further proof that Myanmar conducted the burnings. If villages were burned after Myanmar claims that its clearance operations ended, which is when the military had complete control over the Rohingya villages, then it could only have been the military that burned them, not the Rohingya themselves. In any event, when the Gambia refers to the clearance operations, it includes the military activities spanning from late 2016 through 2018, when Myanmar was engaging in further village destruction and confiscation of Rohingya lands. In conclusion, Myanmar's defense of its clearance operations, that it was only engaging in counterterrorism operations in response to ARSA's attacks, is manifestly false and unsustainable. These operations violated all of the fundamental tenets of legitimate counterterrorism operations, including Myanmar's own fundamental tenets as reflected in their rules of engagement. In fact, Myanmar's rules of engagement constitute a powerful and indisputable statement against interest. They constitute a compelling admission by Myanmar of what it should have done if it had intended counterterrorism. In completely disregarding them, in trampling over them, in setting fire to them, along with hundreds of Rohingya villages, Myanmar left only one explanation for its actions, only one reasonable inference that could be drawn from the resulting pattern of conduct, that it deliberately intended to destroy the Rohingya group within Myanmar. Mr. President, members of the court, thank you for your kind attention. This concludes the Gambia's presentations for the morning session. After the lunch break, Mr. Lowenstein will continue